Well, good afternoon, Dan. Scott Gabbard here with Dan Quinn, the state corn agronomist for uh, Purdue Extension, Purdue University. And today is our inaugural run of the coffee break that we're doing here with Purdue on the Farm. And so this is kind of an informal sit down and talk with agronomists and faculty and staff within Purdue Extension. They're working directly with farmers. Probably might even bring in some farmers in the future as far as relaying what's going on. Um, and since it's winter, harvest is done.
Yep.
The grains in the bin or going to market already. And so things don't really change that much for us, but yet they change a lot. So we transition from infield work to more number crunching and planning for next year. And so I guess probably we'll talk about today, Dan. So first of all, I guess we'll just start with the simple one. How did 2025 go for you and your team?
Yeah, I think, for just about everyone, it was highly variable, right? Largely dependent on where you are. For our team specifically, we have research all over the state, so we kind of get a firsthand look at the differences depending on where you were at in the state. And there's, some areas that got off to a good start, had good finishes, but also a lot of areas that struggled. You look at southeast, eastern parts of the state, particularly, got off to really a tough start with planting. A lot of delayed planting, just wet soils they couldn't get in a timely fashion. So that kind of led to maybe some below average yields in a lot of those areas. But overall, pretty good year, especially when you look at, potential yield estimates and stuff like that. But overall is just highly variable. I said all year, it depended on where you were, and it might have been, across the county line or from 1 mile to the other or one field to the other. It's just kind of the world we live in with the environment and weather variability we have.
So every year's different. I know we always look, it's almost like a sports fan to where next year will be better. And I
Yep.
fully understand, appreciate that. But what are some unique challenges for 2025 as compared to prior years?
I think the first thing is pricing and profitability. I think that's the first thing that's on probably the most of the farmers' minds, right? Crop prices aren't necessarily where they were, and we have some issues with some input prices, fertilizer prices, phosphorus fertilizer, potassium. Some of those are pretty high. So margins are going to be a lot tighter, and you kind of see that reflected in a lot of the conversations we've been having, especially this winter so far. So I think, a lot of the challenges and differences that are going to come this year is just going to be, the profitability aspect, the efficiency. So I think there's, a lot of conversations, a lot of understanding going on right now of maybe what do we need to apply, but also what do we not need to apply that maybe we have in years past, and kind of maybe being, even smarter with some of our decisions when it comes to inputs and applications and stuff like that, and probably looking at things a little bit closer this year, and that always happens when you have the ebbs and flows of the market. But I think that's probably the biggest thing on a lot of folks' minds is just the profitability aspect, and it's probably going to be a little bit tougher year from a profitability standpoint, a margin standpoint to this year than what it has been over the last 3-4 years.
Totally agree. I know that one of the very humbling realities I had early on in my career was that I might be able to help a farmer get 5, maybe even 10 bushels per acre, but all of that could be washed away by the simple by one of the turns in the market, if you will. And so, yeah,
Yep.
a lot of graphs and people watching those markets this winter, I'm sure, and
Yep.
honing their marketing skills too throughout the winter season and going into even to the summer next year, because I know that of course,
Yeah.
and then of course on the input side, things too. There's always that issue. I'm looking forward to sitting down and having a similar conversation with Megan as well. I know she's kind of going around the state and talking about fertilizer inputs and maybe some considerations that one should make, which is it's important for both corn and soybeans, but specifically when you're looking at nitrogen and some other inputs for corn, that becomes a really big deal. Um, Do you have any preliminary findings? I know it's really kind of early still for data. I know that people expect as soon as the combines turn off, that we have results, and that's not quite how it works. It's got to pooling it all together and trying to make sense of it takes a little bit of time. I don't know if you had some observations that you can make from some of your studies you've done this year.
Yeah, we have a few. Actually in the midst of doing that as we speak right now. Everybody wants their data at the same time, right? As you said, when the combines are done, they want the data immediately. But I think, there's some insights. We've been doing quite a bit of work, looking at, nutrient interactions, and Megan's helping a little bit with this too, understanding nitrogen by sulfur, nitrogen by potassium interactions, and how they interact within the plants and within the field. And there's some early insights that, either whether it be sulfur levels or potassium levels can drastically change your optimum nitrogen rates and your response to nitrogen rates as well. So I think that's pretty intriguing. That's really the first year that we've tackled some of that data. So it'll be interesting to see where that goes. Other than that, we've had some, data on, we do a lot of enhanced efficiency fertilizer work and stabilizer work, and with those, a lot of the story is typically pretty similar. They work when the conditions are there to warrant them to work. If we have end-loss conditions, they're going to do what they're supposed to. And in many cases, if we don't have end-loss conditions, we're not going to see much difference between those. And I'm also intrigued. We've got quite a bit of cover crop work too. So really examining sulfur responses and cover crop systems, and seeing pretty drastic, larger magnitude of sulfur responses when you say have a grass cover crop versus when you don't. So I think that's been pretty intriguing, and then, been helping Darcy Talenko, with some of the fungicide work, and some of the, harvest timing work and mycotoxin work. So we're still waiting on a lot of that data to come back from the labs and stuff like that. So it'll be really interesting to dive into those studies. And we have a lot of short stature corn work that we're still working through a lot of the data, and popcorn work. So yeah, we have a little bit ready. We still have a long ways to go. We typically do anywhere from 50 to 60 research trials a year across the state, and that spans from small plot experimental trials to large scale on-farm trials as well. So it takes a while to get through a lot of that data, but we hope to have it, a lot of it ready by the end of January here coming up in early 2026.
Yeah, you preempted me on one of my follow-up questions with regard to the mycotoxin study that you and Darcy have been working on, and how that kind of works out. Um, a lot of research is iterative, to where you kind of build up on the following year, or excuse me, the previous year. But if we're looking at 2026, can we kind of break it down between evolutionary versus revolutionary? You have, because everyone has, several ideas that are kind of built upon the previous year's knowledge, like your short stature corn, maybe the sulfur work, maybe sulfur with the cover crops. Um, Kind of expanding up with that, but also, are there any revolutionary things where you're like, this is just a wild one, we're going to try it anyhow?
I think some of the more out of the box stuff has been really trying to understand hybrid interactions. And what I mean by that is, corn hybrids differ in a lot of ways. They differ in, the ways in terms of how they allocate their yield components, whether it be kernel weight or kernel number. We're diving into, understanding how hybrids differ in their root systems. You bring in the short stature component too, how they differ, physiologically and plant size. But tying specific management to how hybrids, what their architecture, their physiological components are, or their root development is, and really trying to hone in to understand, hey, do we have to maybe rethink how we manage some of these hybrids? If say a hybrid has high kernel number, do we have to maybe manage it a little bit more intensively earlier in the season when kernel number is being developed? Or if it's more of a kernel weight type hybrid, that bigger kernels, do we have to maybe move our management a little bit later in the season during grain fill? And then also, we're working, looking at root systems. Does a more vertical root system versus more horizontal root system, does that differ in how we place our fertilizers, or does it matter at all? So I think that's kind of an area that, is a little bit out of the box, but also an area that I'm, really interested in because, one thing that opens my eyes every year is that we do a lot of work with a lot of different genetics in the same field with very similar traits, very similar maturities, and they will differ. It's amazing how much they can differ, 20, 30 bushel swings in the same field. So trying to, understand that a little bit more, from a lot of different components fertilizer to overall agronomic management to disease management to everything in between. So I think that's an area that, I have a lot of interest in. I think there's a lot of, long ways to go to try and understand that. One thing, with a lot of agronomic research, period, just when you think about size of studies and logistics and also resources that we do a lot of studies with certain management practices on one hybrid or one seed. But not a lot, there's some, but not a lot out there. We have two, three other hybrids out there because the studies can get really big. But, that's something that, we're trying to pay attention to a little bit closer and try and understand a little bit better so that maybe we can fine tune both management, but also a big part of this is hybrid placement and let farmers, okay, if you manage your crops this way, this is the hybrid you need to have in that system versus this hybrid. So I think that's kind of a newer, interesting piece and the avenue we're starting to go down.
Yeah, when I was putting together an article for Prairie Farmer, I was, and I go back and do these types of things, and I'm sure you do as well, where you go back and look as far as where we were so we have some idea of how far we've come.
Yeah.
And one thing that I was looking at the soil survey manual for Shelby County, Indiana, because that's where I'm from, and so I keep one around, and it was printed in 1974. That was a reprint. I think the data generated from like 64 to 66 in that range. So for many folks, that's one lifetime, if you will, and not for everyone, of course, Dan. But I was looking at that and on improved practices. So where someone, applied nitrogen, that's kind of what they called it back then, to where we actually did some management for the crop, is that they said that Crosby silt loam soil, which is about 20, well, it's a lot of the state for
Yep.
one thing. It's about 27% as far as 0 to 2% slopes in Shelby County. I looked that up as well. And they were putting that at 140 bushels per acre. If you did
Yeah.
that today, you'd be bankrupt. And
Yep.
so we already talked about some challenges already with the markets and everything. But yeah, so we've come a long, long way with what we do have, and it's amazing how it just keeps progressing, moving forward. Um, so besides the prices and everything, and that end of it, what are some potential other challenges that we might face going into 2026 that farmers need to be aware of?
I think, one of the biggest challenges is always going to be the environment. Can they control that? No, not always. But one thing that always comes to mind, I'm sure you'll probably talk to Darcy more, is the disease front. Disease is always something that pops up, that rears its ugly head, that changes when it comes in and the severity of it and what diseases are there every single year. So I think, that's something to always be mindful of, and it's always going to be a challenge year in and year out because of the unpredictability of it. So, I think, yeah, the variability of just the environment and the weather and, the frequency of weather events is always going to be a significant challenge. But what comes with that is some of the stressors with it too. When you think of, something like disease or, ear rots, right? One year we can have a bunch of ear rots. Another year we can have none. Or last year we had southern rust really bad in a lot of areas that I've never seen it before, or tar spot. And so I think that's one of the biggest challenges because of the variability and the unpredictability of it. So that's why we always stress that you can't really take a day off in terms of paying attention to your crops and monitoring your crops and understanding what's going on because things can change pretty drastically based on the environment and what's going on. And every single year is different as well. And that's what also gives us more headaches too, is how much stuff differs from year to year.
Yeah, one of those reflections I can't prove, but with regard to, I think a lot of farms at this point in time, they kind of do their, well, they have a set schedule when they're looking for tar spots. So kind of tar spot has really changed the way a lot of folks manage their farms, and I can't help but think that southern rust could have been even a lot worse this year if it weren't that we really, when it hit, was kind of at the time where a lot of folks were already treating for tar spot, and
Yeah.
so didn't. Of course, some people still had some obvious problems. I mean, there were some fields absolutely decimated by it, but even that being said, it could have been much worse if we were already vigilant with the tar spot and probably already scheduling, had some of the chemicals or something scheduled, or some of the fungicides already on hand to mitigate the tar spot. Um, I can't help but think that it could have been much worse if we didn't have that kind of um, maybe not a best management practice, but as far as the idea of looking for the tar spot already, so we're kind of ready to go ahead and do something in the first place.
Yeah, sure.
Um, what are some things? The climate is always going to be a challenge, or the weather, if you will. But
Yep.
this time of years, they've got all these lot of colorful yield maps, and they've already they've got what they paid for last year, maybe a little bit of sticker shock looking at coming into this year, especially when compared to the market prices. What are some things that the farmers can do right now to kind of get themselves a jump start by looking at what did happen, what those costs were, and then plan going into 26?
I think it's a great time to learn. That's one of my big PSAs for this time of year is, that's something we're doing as researchers, but something farmers should be doing as well because they have so much data and so much, a lot of farmers are doing, their own tests and checks and all that and a lot of their own fields. So I think when you get into a year that's where margins are a lot tighter, I think it's even more valuable where you can understand where, hey, this worked or this didn't work, or hey, we saw a strong yield response to this, or profitability response to this, and this say, in-furrow product or foliar product just didn't do anything for us. So hey, we can cut that out or not worry about it. We had a pretty early harvest too this year, so I think that helped with a lot of soil sampling and stuff like that. So, soil sampling is really valuable to be able to plan for next year, especially getting it done this fall and paying attention to, where you need to apply or maybe not need to apply as well. But, this is a great time to learn from, your own farm, but also, there's a lot of meetings going on, whether it be university side, industry side, crop consultants, stuff like that. Be mindful of the information and try and take it all in and try and understand it and maybe pick up one or two things that maybe, worth trying on your own farm as well. But I think it's a great time to look at everything you have and try and understand, what tweaks or modifications can I make for next year. And there's a lot of different things, hybrids, management practices, inputs, fertility rates, stuff like that, that hey, maybe we can change a little bit or tweak a little bit and you take that information now and you can kind of get a plan for next year and then go into next year and maybe make some modifications and see how they do.
Um, is there anything that publication wise or other things that farmers should be looking out for this winter uh, before they really get caught up in the growing season itself?
Yeah, the big one is, you mentioned our website, right? That's where we put a lot of our information and articles there. Our research books, that's something we've tried, they're a lot of work and they take a lot of time, but a lot of folks find value in them and I think they appreciate them. And I get, texts that, hey, when's that research book coming? And it's, October 30th. So We have a chance to do, a lot of trials on a lot of different products and genetics and equipment across every company, right? And so we're able to put a lot of that in the book. So just, a lot of them are snapshots of what the trials were and what we saw. So those are, I think, a good resource to take a look at and say, hey, these trials were done in close to my county or where I'm at, and they've Purdue found this worked and this, but also what this didn't work as well. So those are kind of the nuggets that you can pick up and say, hey, maybe this is something that's worth trying or not trying. And we have a newsletter that we like to do as well. I would say both the research books and the newsletter are supported by Indiana Corn and the checkoff, and they're free as well. So I tell farmers, a lot of the farmers have already paid for it via their checkoff dollars, so they might as well get it. So you can have hard copies sent to you for no cost, and also join the newsletter for no cost as well. And it's a great avenue to get out our information. You also mentioned too, Sean and I have a podcast. Both you, myself, and a lot of us write for some of these, newslet, these farm media outlets. Indiana Prairie Farmers, Successful Farming. A lot of these outlets you can find a lot of our information too. But the main hub where we have a lot of stuff is on our website, and predominantly the newsletter and the research book is where we kind of try to put everything together. But hopefully we get to see a lot of you across the state too this winter with conferences and meetings and county parks and stuff like that.
Very good.
Yeah.
And as Dan already mentioned, this is being supported by checkoff dollars from the Indiana Soybean Alliance and Indiana Corn Marketing Council, and really appreciate them and all the efforts that they actually the impact they have as far as a lot of the work we do. And so, with that, Dan, thank you for the inaugural round of the of our coffee break, and I'm sure we'll improve it in the future, and we'll look back, and both of us will laugh. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
thanks a lot. Take care, and have a great winter season.
Yeah. Thanks, Scott. Thanks for having me.